Hey everyone, it's January 27th, 2025. Welcome back for another deep dive into today's news. All right, so
Always a pleasure to be back.
yeah, so we got a lot to talk about today. Some really interesting stuff actually. We've got a story about coffee.
Oh, always a good way to start.
Yeah, and then we'll touch on a certain former US president.
Uh-oh. Sounds like trouble.
Yeah, a little bit, maybe a lot. And then we'll wrap things up with a story about a trade war that almost was.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Where should we begin?
Well, let's start with everyone's favorite morning beverage.
Coffee.
Okay, so Colombian coffee is like pretty much the gold standard, right?
Oh, yeah. Definitely one of the best.
But you might not know that Colombia just became the world's second biggest coffee producer.
Wow. Really? Who did they overtake?
They knocked Vietnam out of that spot.
That's impressive. A 20% jump in production, that's not easy to do. How'd they pull that off?
Right. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's not just about growing more beans. They've been really smart about it with innovative farming practices and
Makes sense. Focus on quality, streamline the export process, things like that.
yeah, exactly. They're really focused on quality. And speaking of exports, they've got this new system through Alma Cafe. That their National Coffee Federation is pretty cool. So now, get this. Colombian coffee can reach the U.S. in under 72 hours.
Wow. So it's like basically farm fresh coffee delivered to your doorstep in just a few days.
Pretty much. It's amazing. But okay, so here's the question I have to ask as a devoted coffee drinker. Is this all going to make my morning cup more expensive?
That's a good question. I mean, usually when demand goes up, prices follow.
Right.
But it's not always that straightforward. I mean, this boom is great for Colombian coffee growers. They're seeing higher profits, which is fantastic for their economy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Plus, they're becoming more self-sufficient, actually reducing their reliance on imported goods. So there are a lot of moving parts here, both good and maybe not so good. It's something to watch, for sure.
Okay, definitely something to keep an eye on. Now let's switch gears to a story that's, well, a little more, how should I put this?
A little more colorful.
Exactly. Remember when former President Trump wanted to buy Greenland?
Oh, yeah, back in 2019, that was a moment.
Well, he's brought it up again, and this time the response from Denmark has been a little less than diplomatic.
Oh, how so?
Well, a Danish MEP named Anders Vistisen basically told Trump to...
He actually said that.
Yeah, straight up. I mean, we obviously don't endorse that kind of language.
Of course not.
But it definitely shows how strongly they feel about this.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's more than just a political disagreement, right? It's about national pride, history, cultural identity. That's deep stuff.
It is. And honestly, it seems pretty bold for a former president to just assume he can buy a territory that's been part of another country for centuries.
Right. And it really highlights that tension between the U.S. and some of its European allies, especially when it comes to, let's say, unconventional foreign policy moves.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so speaking of tense situations, our next story brings us back to Colombia.
Oh, back to coffee. More price hikes.
Not this time.
Yeah.
This one's about a trade war that almost happened. And this one could have actually hit you right in the wallet.
Oh, wow. Okay, now I'm really interested. Tell me more.
All right, so picture this. It's Valentine's Day, and suddenly those roses you're about to buy, they're 25% more expensive.
Ouch. That's a serious markup. What happened?
So former President Trump threatened tariffs on Colombian imports. It was all because of a disagreement about accepting deported migrants.
Ah, I see. So things got heated over immigration policy?
Yeah, things escalated quickly, and Colombia retaliated with their own tariffs.
Sounds like things were about to get messy.
It were. But thankfully, a deal was struck at the last minute.
That's a relief. So no Valentine's Day flower crisis?
Crisis averted, but the agreement is fragile. This whole thing could flare up again.
So we dodged a bullet this time, but it sounds like this isn't over yet.
Exactly. So while we're all enjoying our Colombian coffee right now, there are definitely some bigger issues at play that could impact us all down the line.
It's crazy how even something as simple as a cup of coffee can be connected to all these complex global dynamics. It's fascinating, really.
I know, right? That's why I love these deep dives.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered booming economies, diplomatic clashes, and a narrowly averted trade war, all before our first break.
And we haven't even scratched the surface.
Exactly. There's so much more to unpack. But we'll have to say that for after the break. So stay with us, folks. We'll be right back.
You know, we've talked about all the economic benefits of this coffee boom in Colombia. But what about the environmental impact? Is this kind of growth even sustainable in the long run?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
More coffee might be great for Colombia's economy and for, my caffeine fix. But what's the cost to the planet?
Well, the Colombian National Federation of Coffee Growers, or FNC for short, they've been pretty proactive. They're promoting sustainable practices, things like renovating coffee farms, improving soil fertilization techniques, using disease-resistant varieties of coffee plants.
So it sounds like they're thinking about the long-term health of their farms and the environment, not just, churning out as much coffee as possible.
Exactly. They're really trying to strike that balance. And another interesting thing is they're reducing their reliance on imported coffee, which actually shrinks their carbon footprint.
Wow, that's pretty cool. It shows that, progress doesn't have to come at the expense of the planet.
Right. It's about finding sustainable solutions.
Okay, so let's circle back to that tense situation between the U.S. and Denmark over Greenland. What's the history there? Has the U.S. tried to buy Greenland before?
Oh, yeah. This isn't a new idea. The U.S. has been interested in Greenland for a long time, going all the way back to the 19th century. But the most serious attempt was probably in 1946, when President Truman offered Denmark $100 million for the island.
Wow, $100 million back then. That was a bit of fortune.
It was. But Denmark politely declined. Even back then, they understood that Greenland wasn't just some piece of land to be bought and sold. It was, and still is, considered a fundamental part of the Danish kingdom, with deep historical and cultural ties.
So it's not just about the land itself, it's about national identity and cultural heritage for Denmark.
Precisely. And for the people of Greenland, the idea of being sold to another country is just offensive. They have their own unique culture and a strong sense of autonomy.
Right, it adds a whole other dimension to this story.
It does, and it reminds us that these international relations, they involve real people, real cultures, real histories.
Okay, so bringing it back to that almost trade war between the U.S. and Colombia.
Okay.
What ultimately led to things calming down? It seemed like it was escalating so quickly.
Well, both sides had a lot to lose. A full-blown trade war would have been a disaster economically, especially for industries that rely on imports from Colombia.
Right, like those Valentine's Day flowers we were talking about.
Exactly. Nobody wants to pay a 25% premium on roses. So there was a strong incentive for both sides to find a solution.
So it sounds like common sense prevailed.
Yeah, I think so. But it's important to remember that the agreement they reached is fragile. The underlying issues, especially the ones related to U.S. immigration policies, those haven't really been resolved.
So this might just be a temporary fix, not a permanent solution.
Exactly. It shows the need for, open communication and diplomacy between the two countries if they want to avoid these kinds of conflicts in the future.
It's a good reminder that these global connections, they're always there. Whether it's a cup of coffee, a territorial dispute in the Arctic, or a potential trade war, what happens in one part of the world can directly affect us all.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to stay informed and think critically about these issues.
It's easy to get caught up in the economic and political side of things, but we can't forget about the human impact of these global events. Real people whose lives are directly affected by these decisions.
That's such an important point. It's easy to talk about these things in abstract terms like trade wars or economic growth, but we have to remember the human cost.
Exactly. For example, we talked about how this coffee boom is benefiting Colombian coffee growers, which is great. But what about the workers who are actually picking and processing the beans? Are they seeing a fair share of the profits? Are their working conditions improving?
Yeah, those are the questions we should be asking. It's about making sure the benefits are reaching everyone involved, not just those at the top.
Right. It's about seeing the human faces behind the headlines and understanding that these seemingly distant events have real-world consequences for individuals and families and communities.
Exactly. And it's also a reminder that our choices as consumers, as citizens, they can make a difference, however small, on these global issues.
Okay, so let's take a break from the heavy stuff for a minute and talk about something that might seem a little lighter on the surface, but actually says a lot about cultural perceptions. Remember that Danish MEP who told former President Trump to F off over the Greenland proposal?
Oh, yeah. That got people talking.
It did. Some people condemned his language, saying it was unprofessional and disrespectful. But others applauded his bluntness. They saw it as a refreshing change from the usual diplomatic dance, a sign that some leaders are fed up with what they see as arrogance.
It's interesting, right? It shows a certain level of frustration with the way things are done in international politics, and maybe a desire for more authenticity from leaders.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, is there a place for that kind of bluntness in these situations? Is it ever okay to break with diplomatic norms and speak your mind, even if it means using strong language?
It's a tough question. I mean, on one hand, diplomacy requires a certain level of tact, but on the other hand, sometimes silence or vague statements can be interpreted as weakness or even complicity. It's about finding that balance.
Right, it's delicate balance.
It is. And it's important to remember that what might be considered offensive in one culture could be perfectly acceptable in another.
It's a good reminder that cultural context matters a lot in how we interpret language and actions.
Absolutely. And as our world becomes more interconnected, it's more important than ever to be aware of those cultural nuances and to approach cross-cultural communication with sensitivity and understanding.
You know, it's amazing how we started with just a few news stories and ended up talking about all these complex global issues.
It is, isn't it? We've covered booming economies, diplomatic standoffs, trade wars, and so much more.
And through it all, we see this common thread, how interconnected everything really is.
Exactly. It's easy to think of these events as isolated incidents, but they're all part of a larger story.
Right. A coffee boom in Colombia affects prices worldwide. A territorial dispute in the Arctic strains relations between superpowers. A trade war can disrupt global supply chains and hit consumers everywhere.
It really underscores that we're all part of a global community, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. Our actions have consequences, and what happens on one side of the world can create ripple effects across the globe.
Which is why it's so important to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and hold our leaders accountable.
We need leaders who understand this interconnected world. Leaders who prioritize diplomacy and cooperation and sustainability.
Absolutely. Leaders who can see the big picture and work together to address these global challenges, not just for their own countries, but for the good of everyone.
Well said. You know, we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff today.
Yeah.
But I want to end on a more positive note.
Yeah, I like the sound of that.
Even with all the challenges we face, there are also incredible opportunities for progress. We're seeing innovation in sustainable agriculture, advancements in renewable energy, a growing global movement for social justice.
That's so true. It's easy to get discouraged by all the conflict and division, but there's a lot of good happening too. And it's not just something happening to us. We can be part of that positive change.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage our listeners to stay engaged, stay curious, and stay hopeful. Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep pushing for a better world.
Because we all share this planet and our fates are intertwined.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of global events, uncovering those hidden connections, and hopefully sparking some thought-provoking conversations along the way.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.